one of the wings wants to be a timekeeper.
Yeah, fine, I'll do it.
Cool. So as always, just kind of make sure that you keep your own time as well. And then I wish you all a good luck. And I would like a very big applause for Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Hello, just want to check if I am audible.
Yeah.
Wildfires in Turkey and across parts of America, flooding in Europe and Asia. The climate disaster is here for us to see. The world is burning and we need direct action, quick action if we are going to save the planet. 2 points of framing before I move on to what the counterfactual is that OP has to defend and tell you why we're better for the environment, but also better for the economy. Let's talk about the climate disaster first. I want to note that while attempts are being made, lots of countries are not fulfilling their promises or are slow to fulfill their promises, and the climate disaster is getting worse every single year. We do not have lots of time. We need to do something right now. The second thing I want to note is that central banks have a responsibility, but this is not going to be a huge change in terms of central bank policy. What does this mean? Biden's green plan, but also the plans of forwarded by institutions like the World Bank or IMF already talk about green investment, what banks need to do, the responsibilities that they have. But secondly, I want to note that central banks have already changed the things that they prioritize throughout history. First of all, they wanted to do something about unemployment. Then it shifted to inflation. Post the financial disaster, it shifted towards ensuring system stability. Central banks always have different targets depending on what the economy requires. And we say that the economy requires the world to fucking exist. But secondly, I also want to talk about the things that happen under their side of the house, which is to suggest that inflation is not something that only crucially happens under our side. The environment and climate disasters affect production cycles, affect the agriculture industry, they displace labor. All of these kinds of exogenous shocks also lead to inflation crucially under their side of the house panel. The second thing I want to also note over here is what the comparative is that they must defend. I think the comparative that they must defend, if we're being generous, is that governments have to do this by taxation and fiscal spending, and therefore support green companies in terms of what they do, instead of what we are likely to do, which is asset purchasing programs which prioritize green companies, banking rates being adjusted favorably to green tech, and all of the kinds of mechanisms that we have under the policy that is given in the info slide. What's the problem then with governments doing this? I want to note a couple of things with governments. The first thing is to suggest that governments do not have independent bureaucrats. Once central bank policy does this, it's not for 4 years, it's for a longer period of time, not depending on political cycles or whether they go right or left. That's the first thing to note. But secondly, I also want to note that governments have their own lobbies, have their own sponsors, so on and so forth. So even when governments are investing in green tech, they might not be investing in the most optimal green tech. They might be investing in green tech that is most beneficial for them and is funding them. But the third thing I want to note, especially with government spending through fiscal spending and taxation, is that it almost always comes at the cost of welfare, or like other programs where the government is investing, because the government doesn't have unlimited finances. There are a few key problems with this. One, we always fuck over the poor. But two, the problem is at the point which these people do not have social welfare or schemes that are protecting them, taxes become higher and higher and higher. People are much more likely to buy into rhetoric of climate change denial, or that this isn't a serious problem, which also gives right-wingers a lot of scope to win elections in the future. I would also note that this is a huge problem in terms of protecting the environment. Also, I would also note that because we are using the finances of the rich, we are not hurting the poor right now. When you're using money from central banks, but also this is going to affect other banks that I'm going to show you, I would note that this means that the responsibility for fighting it is displaced. Now, first of all, why are other banks likely to do this? Or if the central bank sends this, why are we better off in that front? I would note that oftentimes, overnight liquidity of banks, etc., and their portfolios are dependent on central banks. Look at transaction systems, look at requirements of things like liquidity thresholds, which we do to target inflation, etc. So bank policy is influenced by central bank policy. Why is this then good for the environment and good for the economy? Let's talk about why green businesses develop crucially, but also quicker under our side of the house. The most obvious thing is, panel, that we get more capital funneled quickly into this industry. I will take closing if there is anything. If there's nothing, I'll take O.
Yeah, so given that climate change is caused not by our practices, but our consumption, why is growing the market to create more consumption something that's going to address this?
Oh, this is very weird, because if you consume greener goods, then you don't fuck over the environment. If that's your case, that then go for it. Okay, in terms of more capital being available, I want to note that oftentimes these companies produce stuff which is more expensive than other stuff produced by, say, companies that are dependent on fossil fuels, because those sorts of mechanisms are cheaper, right? You've already built systems which allow you to transport oil and gas cheaply, and you produce lots of stuff cheaply. So we allow them to achieve things like economies of scale, but also give them the environment to develop and so on. So that's the first thing. More capital is being funneled in. You get cheaper goods as a result of this, which means that people are likely to buy this sort of stuff, and we give ourselves a comparative advantage. The second thing I want to note is the signaling effect of central bank policy, which is to suggest that oftentimes green investment happens like in competition with other kinds of investment, right? Like, notice, what are equity funds or people who are investing in the stock market or personal private investors likely to do at the point at which they know that a green company is the one that's likely to get the money and other companies are likely to be deprioritized? I think the signal effect of this is you signal to markets that this is what you want to invest in the future. So you get even more capital on our side of the house, and more capital is going to be beneficial because of the impacts I'm going to talk about later. The third thing I want to note is oftentimes you also have a pace of change of industries, right? Like of industries that are already dependent on pollutants. Lots of companies want to shift to environmental friendly methods, but unfortunately, there's an economic incentive for them to not do so quickly, and especially given that there are huge costs of transactions that these companies need to undertake. I would note that oftentimes these companies are controlled by stakeholders who decide who sits on the board of directors and so on and so forth. When stakeholders are likely to then see a shift in the market, they're also likely to pressure changes in how these companies operate and how these companies use fossil fuels, etc. For instance, this increases the incentive for existing companies in the market to become greener, and therefore makes our environmental impact bigger. The fifth thing I want to note is oftentimes this creates jobs, which is to suggest that when you invest in green technology, because it's a new industry and also requires a lot of labor for things like building wind farms or building solar farms or whatever, this requires a lot of people to be employed in the sector. I want to note the second thing over here, which is also the fact that oftentimes these places are located outside of city centers. Environmental investment doesn't only happen within city centers, which is good, because now we give employment to people who do not have access to employment usually under their side of the house. And this also benefits developing countries, for instance, which see lots of capital flight because environmental dangers going up. Why is this something that is the most important thing in the round? The first thing is to suggest that the environment affects everyone, it affects the lives of everyone. So long-term sustainability. Secondly, I want to talk about future generations, which are also going to be affected by the stuff that we do. The third thing I want to note is that the environment also affects the economy. So if they want to protect inflation and jobs in the future, then they must also care about this. Panel, the world is dying. We need to do something quickly to protect it. This is the only way. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I would now like to welcome the leader of the opposition. Hear, hear.
Yeah, can I check that I'm audible?
Yes.
All right, cool. The notes. Cool. Speech will be beginning in 3, 2, 1. Panel, counterintuitively, why is this debate not actually about climate change? Note that it says that we are going to get greener tech, we are going to reduce our carbon footprint, but the technology that is required for us to reduce the carbon footprint when engaging in production to zero is probably something that we do not possess yet. This is to say that if opening government's claim is that we are able to tackle climate change by providing incentives to produce things in a greener way, ultimately this is something that doesn't matter if the incentives that are provided means that you are able to produce more, but just at a less damaging thing to the environment. Because if you produce a thing more times that causes a smaller damage, it is likely that it is not going to be that different from producing less things with a higher amount of damage, therefore meaning that insofar as you cannot possibly reduce the amount of damage that you are causing to the environment to an extent that requires you to be making no damage to the environment, because note that all production has some sort of trade-off with the environment. When you incentivize these aspects of the industries to engage in massive amounts of growth, specifically you do not access the benefits that opening government talk about. Why else is this debate not then about climate change? Because the burden that opening government try and push on us is to say that governments are going to be really bad actors to invest in green tech. I just think that clearly the actors that are going to be investing in green technology are not governments, but it is probably private actors for a variety of reasons. Firstly, I think there's a huge amount of growth potential within climate change research technology, whereby if you are the person who is able to crack these things, you are going to get massive amounts of returns by being able to speculate off it. Secondarily, the costs to enter this industry have become substantially lowered because of repeated eras of government subsidization. Thirdly, recognize that there is economies of agglomeration that they are able to utilize in order to engage in climate change research technology, whereby now that the market has been broken into to some extent, corporations are able to determine what other corporations have fucked up on, find niches, and then be able to develop things that are capable of addressing this problem. Fourthly, often climate change technology is a vanity project for these Elon Musk types, whereby not only do they have a profit incentive to be able to be the one who develops something revolutionary for it, but they also want to be the one who becomes Billy Big Bollocks and is able to access not only the market capture that is brought by it, but also the sense of prestige for addressing this. What this therefore then means for the opening government case is that, one, insofar as they have failed to prove why this growth is something that is actually good, because I will address this later, given that it is directly contradictory with their incentives about trying to reduce climate change, and given that we are capable of proving that there is still a substantial amount of research and development into climate change that happens on our side, they do not activate the benefits of our case. What are we going to tell you then? Quite simply, the framing that you need to take in this debate, per opening government's own case, is that there are industries right now that are reliant on the utilization of fossil fuels. Opening governments say they want to diversify away, but they can't. This is correct. And now that central banks are no longer going to be giving favorable rates to the non-central banks that would otherwise be putting capital into these businesses get fucked over, and you create a vast swathe of job losses in industries that are unable to diversify their practices yet. This is what opening opposition are going to win on. Before I get onto that, CG.
Even if I accept your analysis that private actors are the best capable actors to pursue innovation, surely it's a good thing that we expedite this process via the central bank.
No, it's not a good thing for the analysis I'm going to give you, because one, there is a trade-off when central banks do things, but there isn't a trade-off for private actors, meaning that there is a trade-off in terms of the non-climate change clash in this debate, but the climate change clash doesn't have a trade-off because that's going to be addressed by private actors. What then is the trade-off that I'm referring to? Framing specifically then what it looks like. Central banks, the way in which they are going to mechanize this by trying to target specific corporations and change their practices through market efficiency, is they are likely going to offer favorable rates to other banks who would otherwise be lending to these industries, and they are going to change their incentive structure to make it preferable for them. What this probably looks like is things like giving them preferential interest rates or lower capital reserve requirements if they start funneling their money into green tech industries instead. The reason then why there is a substantial trade-off in the amount of investments that these banks can do is that ultimately they have to make weigh-offs about what their portfolio is going to look like and where their investment is going, meaning that when they realize that the investments that they would otherwise be putting into industries that are required to pollute are not going to make substantial enough returns for them, immediately this aspect of their portfolio is going to be withdrawn and diverted to green tech industries. Note that opening government might claim this as a benefit, but I want to make three observations. One, if they claim that this is going to be the tipping point for polluting industries to diversify, it is unclear how they are going to be capable to do so without the initial capital to offset this. Secondarily, I've proven that we are still able to access the benefits in terms of investment in green tech, meaning that we don't have to take the trade-off that they are trying to impose upon us. But thirdly, and I think this is very important, the problem is that specific contexts, either in manufacturing hubs in the developed world or in specific industries in the developing world that are reliant on the utilization of products like plastics, this immediately fucks them over when they are unable to access capital as a consequence of this motion, and they immediately have to weather a massive short-term shock. Why are they invested in the status quo? One, they have a competitive advantage whereby they are able to utilize things that have low production costs and have great degrees of output, meaning that they are able to use the benefits of fossil fuels to their advantage. Secondarily, they are perceived to be stable investments because of the consistent production output that they have. Thirdly, specific contexts like industries that are emerging in the developing world are useful to have in portfolios because of the massive amounts of speculative potential for them eventually to provide you great degrees of profit returns. 4 reasons why they use fossil fuels and are unable to diversify. 1, they don't have a history of research and development within these sectors, so are unable to do this quickly. Secondarily, they are unable to offset the upfront cost, particularly in contexts like the developing world. Thirdly, often they exist in contexts whereby they are resource rich and subsequently have to use those. Fourthly, often they are primary industries, which are contingent on either the production of something that is pollutant or the specific extraction of it, meaning that there is no functional way that they are able to diversify. Note that we are able to get them to diversify eventually when we keep putting capital into them, but now when you cut off that source of investment, specifically this is going to be the tipping point for them not only being unable to eventually diversify, but for the mass job losses that are going to occur as a consequence of it, for forcing people to lose their jobs because they're doing practices that we've forced them into through processes like colonial extraction. You cannot trade these people off for a speculative, symmetric long-term benefit. Kind of proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I would now like to welcome Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
That is amazing. Right. Right. OO cannot have the cake and eat it too. It's as simple as that. First, let's take OO out, then onwards to greener pastures. Firstly, look, you cannot claim that on one hand, you have so much investment already going into green technologies and all of these things that we need to do are already happening, but at the same time saying the only way you get these mass job losses you're talking about is if you push private investors into it through monetary policy. Like either the development of technologies that are direct market substitutes is already happening and they're gonna displace labor anyway, or this is not happening, but then we have a time horizon issue within which this investment is not happening, and then you need to stimulate it through our mechanism, and then talk about whether there's an unemployment or not. You cannot claim the unemployment harm, but at the same time say that those things are developing anyway at a pace that we needed. This might work in an infinite time horizon debate in which we have, all the time to switch the economy to something else. This is what we don't have. But secondly, like they note, these big companies are unable to diversify because they don't have research and development, and they cannot offset upfront costs. Like Rio Tinto has all the money to change. Shell has all the money to change. The biggest polluters are the biggest international conglomerates that have the most patents in the world on green technology, that have the biggest development centers in the world, that are the ones that are stalling this technology because it's in their benefit to do the cheaper thing now, to get more money now, because their interest, it's not social interest, it's private interest. This is why you need to incentivize their private interest to meet the social interest, like the basic market failure analysis. But lastly, we tell you, like, if we're talking about the developing countries, if anything, they're the ones that are going to get fucked by the climate change the most. Like, they're the ones that are suffering. If anything, they're also the ones that are the first one to implement green technology, like anti-flooding mechanisms in India, Bangladesh and flooding systems. Like, they're the ones that are actually implementing those things. Existence of these technologies directly improves the overall welfare of those countries and is likely to lead to less instability there overall. Like, economy isn't only about employment, it is about overall stability of availability, goods and services overall. This is how we take out OO. Okay, let's talk about how how our mechanism achieves the shift productively. What they're saying is, oh, the problem is that those big companies will not diversify if you push them into it. Like, one, I'm still not sure why they diversify on their, like, what's the incentive of Rio Tinto to change, like, ever, or like at least in time to produce something effective. So let me explain how this happens on our side. Look. Big private companies are oftentimes incredibly credited on their other side because they exist on over the idea of leverage. So the idea is I borrow something, I make a lot more, and the difference is the one that I'm taking home. What does this mean? This means that Rio Tinto every now and then comes to Goldman Sachs and says, look, I want to turn over my revolver credit. I want to, take another loan to execute a merger. All of those things happen on daily basis. This is what central bankers do. What this means is that the central bank changes its policy. When they come back, suddenly the rate at which they're doing this revolver credit has like doubled. It suddenly does not make sense for them anymore to produce things in the way they do, to leverage themselves in the way they do, because it is too costly. No, this is explicitly going on private interest of shareholders. This is decreasing their profit margins. This makes them, their skin in the game, not worth it anymore. This is why you're likely to get changes there, because this is their basic business model, is leveraging themselves and getting profit out of it. You're tackling this directly by instituting new rules. But not you say, oh, but they might go to another bank. No. Client relationships, when it comes to private investment banking, are one of the most important things, because you know their company and you have a long-term established relationship. Even if you go to another bank, then it is still the same regulation that you're dealing with. Like, in the same way as you cannot take out crazy credits, this is just another regulation that's added on top. But secondly, let's talk about where the most money in the world is currently. Look, the biggest investors are private equity funds. They're the biggest vehicles of liquidity in the world. How do they invest? Mostly they're comprised of older citizens that have a lot of money and like things that they have known before. Rio Tinto is a great example of something they like investing in because they know it. But they also like stability of central bank on the other side. What this means is, as central banks have started pushing this more aggressively, like through the past 10 years, by the way. But then now, when you make a legislation that explicitly says, from now until eternity, is it a central bank goal to support this kind of businesses? This effectively raises the price of these assets, but also collateralizes them, because central bank is standing behind them with their mandate. This is the kind of investment that private equity funds are likely to find sexy, but even more pension funds are likely to find sexy, because this makes them stable, and this is how you get money funneled in here. Note, this is an exclusive mechanism in which you don't engage in a government trade-off. They say, oh, monetary policy, there's no trade-off in private investment. No, they're supporting private investment that is subsidized by subsidies. Subsidies do possess a trade-off between social welfare systems and governments, or giving subsidies to green technology. This plan does not involve this kind of trade-off. The trade-off is literally taking money away from companies like Rio Tinto, because they're disadvantageous for investors, and putting them into other companies. You do not engage with social welfare, but you change private investor incentives, and this is how you get accelerated change. At this point, closing. Opening.
Yeah, so corporate practices are cultivated by the fact that they have to meet the demands of our consumers. Given that those demands are going to be static, how do you think their practices are ever going to change?
Right. I mean, I don't know what your answer is on your side to this. What we say is, given the demands are there, we need to incentivize the development of technologies, that implementation of technologies that, by the way, already exist, through these mechanisms, so that private interest matches social interest at the point where consumer of electricity at the end does not care in which way it's produced. This is why you can switch Rio Tinto from something that's polluting to something this is not. But also, lastly, some preemption if like closing comes in and talks about inflation and says, oh, this is going to go out of proportion. One, we're telling you that these kind of investment changes have happened in the past, and in the same way as stability was implemented as a crucial goal for central banks in the past, this is how you're able to guide your investors too. Secondly, those investors are expert investors that know what happens in an economy, especially if central bank says, look, we're just shifting asset purchasing programs from one asset to another. This is unlikely to produce a massive change. Because they're expert investors, this does likely do not change expectations within the market. But also lastly, inflation is problematic at the point when you have a lot of unemployment, because this squeezes the consumer. At the point when these kind of investments are likely to employ a lot of people, and note, employ them over a long time, sustainably, even a slightly higher inflation, which I honestly don't think it happens, is likely a trade-off that we are happy to take. For all those reasons, open a government.
Thank you very much for that speech. I would now like to welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition here.
Can I just check really quickly? Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Just 1 second. Okay. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the reason why certain states are so reliant on fossil fuels in order for their economy to function is not because of any reason more insidious than a flat reliance that has been established through necessity or established through a history or legacy of colonialism that has removed their ability to economically develop. Let's be really clear then. We accept that this motion does accomplish a lower volume of investment in polluting industries. We don't really care if this pivot is gradual or rapid, but the nature of speculative investment is always going to be forward thinking, meaning that this pivot is likely to occur quickly, regardless of how staggered the implementation of this policy is. You aren't going to sink $1 million into mining infrastructure in a developing nation if you know that in 10 years nobody will value your asset much and there's no capital for growth potential or expansion of your existing asset. I want to do some direct rebuttal then before I move on to rebuilding some of Jason's case. I think this clearly isn't just the big polluters, particularly given the industries more reliant on investment from banks are those which are emerging. Big polluters also don't change much here because the problem is their massive amount of production output. There's no way you can entirely reduce their pollution when they have such a substantial demand to meet, and corporate practices don't really change when you're not able to change the consumption patterns of people. Specifically then, I think what this pivot more looks like is industries that have bad environmental effects but aren't specifically like fuel industries, probably like manufacturing or something. Specifically then, developing countries most fucked over by climate change is exactly why they need access to investment to be able to offset the initial cost of diversification in order to be able to develop their economy so that this is actually practical. Let's be really clear on the comparative then here. Green tech investments are already incredibly fucking attractive in the status quo. Why is this? Number one, massive growth potential because you're using them is an eventuality, right? Two, production costs are sinking rapidly currently due to massive R&D investment, driving down costs and increasing productivity. Three, massive government investment already into R&D means that corporations get to piggyback off investments that the government made and they don't have to sink these costs themselves. Four, the inevitability of the global economy being entirely reliant on green tech in the future because we have finite fossil fuel reserves. Corporations want to get in early specifically because investing now to get this first mover or second mover advantage within a state or a specific field of renewable energy is very valuable. And five, vanity projects, which is the reason Jason told you for good PR. Therefore, no fucking green tech startup corporations in the status quo with positive potential in whatever tech that aren't already being showered in R&D capital and infrastructure capital exist. Specifically then, if the delta in investment in green tech is not significant, what does change here? Banks become averse to investment in high polluting sectors, with the comparative being investment in more neutral industries that they aren't being punished for investing in. They aren't necessarily green, just neutral, like tech industries, software, pharma, bread and butter stable industries that they're replacing investments that likely had a low but stable and consistent return, i.e. steel manufacturing or something like this. This is true because lean portfolios have a neat spectrum of risk to ensure return. So if you're replacing something that was previously quite stable, you're also going to want quite a stable investment, something that's not speculative. And so this is why we're not getting this huge amount of innovation or something. And the pivot has to happen because the return yield was already low in these industries because they had like the stable risk and low profit margins generally. Why then are developing nations so reliant on high polluting industries, and why is this so unlikely to change? All the reason Jason tells you about primary sector reliance and being often quite resource rich in terms of natural resources, but also because they have necessary lowering of environmental regulations in order to possess a comparative advantage in things like manufacturing. Panel, nickel is not mined in Indonesia because it is a rare mineral and there aren't reserves elsewhere. It's mined there because the government has provided the incentive of loosening environmental restrictions to attract corporations that want to mine this mineral. I think you can probably say the exact same for manufacturing and heavy industry. You can say the same for agricultural processes like cow silage covering in India is just not very strict, which means they're able to be a huge like food. They're able to have a lot of investment in their agricultural sector. These states are specifically reliant on not cracking down in order to ensure a comparative advantage for corporations and to secure future foreign investment in future industrialization and urbanization of their nations. Government then specifically have to stand over a rapid pivot away, leading to the pullout of individual corporations and existing corporations and potential expansion of existing industries. Before I move on, I'll take a POI for closing.
As per your analysis, can you name me one hedge fund or institutional investor who will put in a sizable amount of money if these ESG companies have only massive speculative growth potential that can be actualized in at best 10 years?
Sorry, I'm sorry. I don't think I really understand this POI. You're saying hedge funds won't invest in these speculative industries. These industries, like manufacturing stuff, aren't speculative. They're probably replacing their investment in these industries with something that's pretty stable, because generally these are like low interest, low return industries like manufacturing, steel production, agriculture, that kind of stuff. What then this probably looks like is a rapid pivot away specifically from these industries and towards other neutral industries like pharma or something, or like med tech, stuff that doesn't really change all that much, but not really an investment in green tech for all the reasons we've already told you. I think what this rapid pivot away probably initially looks like is just people losing their fucking jobs. This is specifically important because people in developing countries that OG want to talk about won't fucking live to see the floods or the natural disasters that they talk about if the economy collapses and people starve to death. Number two, removal of all ability to accelerate your own economic development. Specifically, a lot of what this looks like, because these countries don't have a lot of native investment or native capital reserves, it looks like a removal of the incentive to invest in foreign industry altogether. Specifically, there's no alternative targets for FDI within these countries themselves other than these high polluting industries. What this looks like is people just investing more in domestic industries as a comparative. The comparative then means that you don't get, in these nations, you don't get all of these massive growth in jobs outside of primary sector activities, which means more people end up doing things like subsistence farming. They have less food security. They have less access to infrastructure and less access to services like medicine. You also get a lack of ancillary industries that typically open up in these nations as a result of industrialization. This looks like you make a factory and now you have to have like accountants and stuff to manage the activities of that factory. I think you also aren't able to establish infrastructure that can be used for other purposes, i.e. you get this like big manufacturing hub and you're able to get like better water, better investment in like sanitation and stuff, because specifically the factory needs water supply or something like this. And I think what this also looks like is having no future potential for economic growth generally, because specifically developing countries are really reliant on FDI in order to get any kind of economic development whatsoever. I think what this looks like is less countries being industrialized, but I also think this looks like less potential for being more environmentally friendly within these nations, because it costs so much to invest in renewable technology, and they will have to do it eventually, but they're not going to be able to afford it if they weren't able to get any native industries to develop in the first place, and they didn't get any of the ancillary jobs. I think for all of these reasons, opening government screwing over the developing world, and they haven't really offered us any alternative for how they're going to ameliorate this. For all of these reasons, proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I would now like to welcome the Member of Government here.
Hello, am I audible? Can I use yours? Yes. Hi, sorry, can I check if I'm audible?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. I'll be taking POIs in the chat, but feel free to unmute yourselves and POI me if I'm not taking you by the 5th minute also. Okay, without further ado, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I want to talk about two things in this speech. Firstly, I want to explain why the private sector uniquely is unable to provide capital. And second, I want to talk to you about the collective action problem and how we ensure jobs for future generations. Firstly, on the private sector. Panel, the overall strategy in this debate is to say climate change is a wash and win on jobs. If I can show you that climate change is not a wash, we argue that the lives of Bangladeshi individuals are just far more important than jobs. So OG tells you that the government has limited capacity to be able to engage in financing, but the OO is quite smart. Jason says, hey, it's not the government, it's private sector. It's angel investors investing in green technology, and therefore they defeat OG on that account, right? So what OO says is that we can use the private sector to attain environmental impacts. And the mechanism for this is A, speculative investment, and B, massive growth potential. 4 structural responses, which I think takes out the opening opposition in this case. Firstly, many angel investors are actually unwilling to invest specifically in green technology. Why? Because oftentimes the speculative returns and the high rate of return is just not worth the short-term risk in status quo. That is to say, the problem is there are high startup costs with very low chance of returns in the status quo. But second, and this mechanizes like a lot of things that DLO says, right? Because there are other forms of investment for these angel investors to engage in that are A, less risky, and B, offer the same high rates of returns. The example of tech and pharma is an example for our side of the house. That is to say, we think that investors like SoftBank and Masayoshi Son are far more likely to engage in investing in Uber or investing in Grab or investing in big pharma companies, because these are the entities which provide far higher potential for profit. It's empirically untrue for DLO to say tech and pharma are low profit. Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 crisis, I think, is a perfect example of how the pharma industry provides massive profits, right? Like literally all of my pharma stocks have just ballooned due to the COVID-19 crisis. But second, it's untrue to say that tech does not have high profits, right? So not green tech, but like companies like Facebook or Amazon, for instance, they were able to get startup capital from angel investors. This is important because if angel investors have all these alternatives that they can invest in, it's unclear why they would invest in green technology specifically with far higher startup costs, but crucially, not the same rate of return because it's ultimately very speculative. But third response, even in their best case scenario, at best, they get a small number of firms who get funding from angel investors. The delta on our side of the house is that we get funding for small and medium-sized firms too, which means ultimately we expedite the speed of change. But 4, we tell you that many of the private banks like JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs in status quo have no structural incentive to provide these loans because many of their clients come from oil companies and the fossil fuel industry. What do we hear then from DLO? DLO says, but many companies engage in vanity projects. Panel, I'm unsure why they think that's a good thing for them, because even in their best case scenario, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk engage in space exploration and try to go and colonize Mars. But what we really want is substantive, non-vanity projects like the building of dams, the investment in solar energy, all of which we think have high startup costs, high startup capital, but crucial substantive benefits on our side of the house. So we don't think why OO says vanity projects is the tipping point to their argument. But also, right, I just want to note the comparative here. The growth potential on our side of the house is far higher on our side of the house when we reduce the viability of the fossil fuel industries. That is to say, when we significantly increase the cost of borrowing for companies like ExxonMobil, that is when we actually enhance the growth potential of the green tech industry. Because it is only in a world where the fossil fuel industry faces higher cost of borrowing, vis-a-vis the green tech industry facing lower cost of borrowing, that is the world in which the profits of the green tech just become far higher, at a point to which more individuals are likely to pivot towards green energy as opposed towards oil. So that argument about massive growth potential is contingent on our analysis, and that's why the central bank needs to step in, panel. This is important, right? Because it's only in a world where the central bank intervenes and reduces cost of borrowing for the green industry and raises the cost of borrowing for the other industry, that is how we achieve the massive growth potential. Then they say, but there's government intervention. But I want you to note, I think OG does a good job explaining why there's limited ability for government intervention. But also, at a point at which the fossil fuel industry is always a viable alternative, the scale of government intervention that you need is also a lot higher, which means on our side of the house, we think that government intervention just becomes far more effective in scope and scale when you don't have to always cater to the fact of A, massively high startup costs, but also B, the sort of things that they talk about. But why are there massively high startup costs in this debate, right? Because I think oftentimes you never succeed with the first piece of research and development, right? Because R&D just takes a lot of time before it can eventually manifest into status quo. But B, also because in the unfortunate situation, you don't have the necessary consumer base that's willing to buy in to begin with, which means you need a huge injection of capital that we don't think exists on their side of the house. This is important, panel. Why? And this is an important piece of framing, right? Because at the point to which OO cannot prove that climate change is a wash, I think that they have to live with the consequences of climate change being an undeniable reality on the ground. Yes, Jason.
Yeah, so investments are structured through portfolios that reduce risk by investing in multiple speculative industries. Irrespective of incentive structure, these portfolios invest in green tech and Uber to reduce risk, so climate change is a wash.
Okay, so panel, I want you to know that the overall mechanism is now diversification of portfolio, guys. But okay, at best, they get 5% diversification, but 95% is still going to be in your top glove, your Facebook, your Amazon, which means once again, they don't get the sort of massive tipping point that we have on our side of the house. But lastly, I want to engage, and my last extension is going to be this idea about jobs, right? So Both sides of the house agree that there are some countries like maybe Indonesia or Congo with mass natural reserves, right? And like natural resources. But I think DLO herself concedes that these natural resources are finite. Why is that important? It's important because at best they can protect jobs for the next 10 years, the next 20 years, but eventually future generations still don't have jobs anyway. What we solve on our side of the house is the collective action problem, because many of these countries do know that they have finite resources. Many of these countries do know that if they don't diversify their economy, in the long run, people will still lose their jobs. The problem is, as DLO herself concedes, many of these countries don't have the capital reserves to engage in mass fiscal policy. And that is why we think we need the central bank to come in to facilitate the conditions of mass pivoting. This is important, right? Because in the almost best case scenario, they protect jobs for the next 10 to 20 years. On our side of the house, we solve the collective action problem and we ensure the sustainability and viability of the industry in the long run. But the last piece of framing is this panel. Even if I buy OO, right? Like OO has a tension here, because if you believe that like speculative investment in green tech is so successful, right? And the fossil fuel industry is just going to die anyway, right? That means that on their side of the house, they lose most of the jobs, right? So they necessarily have to accept that there's a tension in their case. If they say that speculative investment is really so successful, most of those individuals who rely on gas and fossil fuel industries are going to lose their jobs anyway. But most importantly, right, in our absolute worst case scenario, we don't care if the US worker loses his job. We care that the Bangladeshi person does not die from coastal flooding. We are incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I would now like to welcome the member of opposition. Here.
Right, checking that I'm audible and visible.
Yes.
Right, points of information in the Zoom chat, please. I'll do my best to take one from government at some point in my speech. Three things in the speech with rebuttal integrated. Firstly, on the likely response of companies, which is to cut costs, underpay and abuse workers instead of transitioning to green technologies. Secondly, how this undermines political action on the environment and why this is more important. Thirdly, on how this harms the ability of central banks to control inflation and market stability, which are more important outcomes in this debate. So going through each of these things in turn, firstly, analysing the likely response of companies. I think the response of companies is important because they are the ones on the ground making decisions about exactly what they are doing. I would note for a couple of reasons that it is going to be always cheaper to maintain fossil fuels and cut costs and underpay your workers or abuse them to a greater extent than you're doing under the status quo when this kind of policy gets put into place. Note that, like, yes, they always have the incentive to cut costs anyways, but specifically this kind of policy makes it so much more urgent and pressing for companies to take this sort of action. Why is it more cheaper to do this? It requires like very large scale restructuring to switch to green technologies. You have to hire new workers with different expertise. You have to change all your production processes. Noting that many companies don't actually operate in both environmentally friendly technologies and like fossil fuel extraction. Secondly, restructuring takes a lot of time, and the profit that you're going to see from that only happens like far into the future versus continuing with the current business model, which already works and is already turning a profit. Thirdly, fines on work abuse, etc., less of a deterrent because it's better to take this risk of abusing workers, etc., to cut costs because of the profit that you're able to gain from that. Fourthly, changing business models are uncertain because you don't know about the certainty of profit delivery, whereas your current business model has shown that it is able to deliver for you. Fifthly, companies want to maintain control over their own future. They'd rather bet. They don't want to be subject to like patents from other companies and be reliant on those sorts of things, those kinds of risks. They want to have control over the company so they're able to generate investment going into the future. The significance of this analysis is as follows. We show you that it's unlikely that companies are going to switch large scale from fossil fuels to green tech, but rather they're going to just cut corners, abuse their workers and treat everyone worse. And the significance of this is like these companies don't become like significantly less profitable. So you don't get the investment shift that opening government is talking about. But secondly, like vulnerable workers, those working for these companies who are getting their pay now cut, are also harmed in that kind of sense. So we also have an economic harm there. Second part of the speech on how this undermines political action on the environment. The first thing I would note here is just some mitigation about why monetary policy is inherently ineffectual. OO just says that like, oh, this kind of investment is going to happen anyways. I'm going to respond directly to OG's mechanisms of monetary policy and explain why they're ineffectual. The first thing to notice here is that monetary policy is always beset with delays. It's known for being slow. Like when a central bank acts, like the central bank does not directly interact with investors or consumers. The actions that it takes must flow through the central bank to commercial banks and then to lenders. But also the investment firms that opening government wants to talk about don't really take out loans to invest because that's not quite a thing. They have people putting money into them to invest. So I'm not sure how they're directly impacted by monetary policy through that chain, even in the first place. But secondly, I think there's just a limited ability to act in terms of monetary policy. Interest rates are already at record lows in most parts of the world. You can't put them below zero. I don't know how that makes much of a marginal difference. Why then do we flip this with political action? Just firstly on what we mean by political action. So yes, some of it is fiscal policy and spending, but oftentimes it's things like regulation, banning certain environmental practices, taxing diverse practices, carbon trading schemes, whether you allow fracking in the United States, whether you approve the new oil pipeline going through South Dakota. Why is there real potential for this kind of regulation and action to be taken on opposition side? I think there's just increasing awareness of climate change around the world. Like people, like a larger proportion of people are recognizing that it is due to man-made action, and it is also a very pressing issue that needs to be addressed. But there's also an awareness that there's only so far that individual action can go, and therefore governments must take action on this kind of thing. Why does that go away on the government side? Three reasons. The first is that there's going to be a strong perception that action has already been taken. Because note, the right wing generally in most parts of the world doesn't favor taking significant action on climate policy because that's like their ideological beliefs and probably hurts their like fossil fuel donators, etc. So any like action that the central bank's going to be taken is going to be constantly reiterated by the right wing, and you're going to get this argument that we have already taken a climate change action that we need to do. Note that political capital is limited. That's why you talk about the Green New Deal instead of like, oh, these policies that we're going to do next year, this year, and then all the green policies we're going to do in the future years. Like you only have the political to pass one of these, political capital to pass one of these things. Secondly, the perception of responsibility shifts. Instead of government having the responsibility to regulate because it's the only actor able to do so under the status quo, and now shifts to the central bank as well because of the ability to act in this area. Thirdly, I think there's also going to be lobbying now directed at central banks instead of governments. Note that because the amount of lobbying that we have is like constant or fixed, this is going to be a hard because central banks have a long tradition of independence and only listening to their own analysts and being immune to political pressure and public lobbying and those sorts of things. Responding directly to OG's like attempts at preemption on this, they say that government bureaucrats are not independent. I think this is just like false in the vast majority of countries where the civil service is professional. Secondly, they say that you have lobbyists that make things inefficient. I would note that this is mitigation. It only says that like it's still going to be good. It might not be the most efficient, but it's still going to be good. I think the public's also able to overcome lobbying. And thirdly, in terms of the stuff about trade-offs on how you're going to be spending money and there's a cost to welfare, I would note that there's lots of government and political action that you can take, like regulation, like bans, that don't actually involve those sorts of trade-offs when it comes to welfare. Why then is this political analysis the most important thing in this debate? Firstly, we directly question OG's mix. Secondly, we show larger harms because these sorts of government actions allow investment to happen or not in the first place. If you don't have an oil pipeline, if you're not allowed to do fracking, like all this debate about whether you invest in that becomes irrelevant because those things are physically not allowed. We take on OG at a higher burden and show that even if the environment and climate change is most important, it becomes better under our side. Before I move on, OG.
Yeah, you want action which bans stuffs and regulates profitable practices. If that is true, then you can't make the case that companies abuse workers because presumably all the political action you get leads to the same outcomes that you're trying to not get.
I think this happens in like separate ways. You like if you ban this kind of thing going into the future, note that many of these are future practices. You don't have a direct harm on workers at the moment. Finally, then on inflation and market stability and the harms of this, note that the traditional role of central banks is things like controlling inflation, ensuring market stability, because in many cases governments can't be trusted to do some fiscal policy. There's always an incentive to tax more, tax less and spend more, because this is immediately popular to the government, even if it leads to higher inflation and bubbles and worse shocks later on. How do we undermine this? Note that the green tech and energy sector is really large. All production requires energy, but this is also a growing sector of the economy. You can't easily change like interest rates, etc., in this area because it would undermine the stability investment that OG wants to claim. Like if you raise the interest rates on green technologies, you're not going to have as much investment as they would like to have. Why is this significant? Because inflation is something that we constantly experience, including now as many countries recover from COVID. It's something that erodes incomes, especially for the poor and vulnerable who are most likely to be on fixed incomes and therefore have less ability to afford necessities. But it also makes shocks worse, which are most impactful on the poor because they're more likely to be in unstable employment and fixed term contracts and they lose this. I think this shows another impact on the most vulnerable that happens both in developing and developed countries and is therefore more significant. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I would now like to welcome Government Whip.
Hello there. Can I check that I'm audible?
Yes.
Lovely. Panel, starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we're going to win this debate by proving 3 things. First, I will take out the entire op bench by proving to you how OO's counterfactual angel investors makes them financially illiterate and is infeasible in the status quo, and why CO's extension about political action is just like ignorant of real-world politics and why it's non-feasible. If we show why the counterfactual is non-feasible, then we already take it over the entire op bench. But I'm going to go a step further by suggesting we also take it over OG by virtue of the fact that we prove the benefit on the developing world. First, CO and their new extension. The first thing they say is interest rates cannot change because the interest rates in the status quo are already them low. Yeah, I guess, but like you could always have negative interest rates, which makes it more profitable. It's unclear to me why you haven't read the Financial Times and realized this is a viable policy. But second of all, I would point out that the central bank has massive influence, which is why whenever we tweak the interest rates just a bit, whether it's 0.5% or 0.1%, the market goes into hysteria and there are massive changes about it. So we buy CEO's claim that the climate crisis is damn urgent, along with the concomitant claim that the private sector isn't going to work because of the structural incentives of the private sector continue entrenching itself. I would suggest the counterfactual of structural change via the central bank is the only alternative. They say, but we got political action. I have 3 observations about this. First of all, this is already like 7 speakers late because as opening correctly points out, there's the issue of corporate lobbying. I want the next speaker to tell me why every Republican who's literally bankrolled by the largest carbon polluters like ExxonMobil has any political incentive to make things like the Green New Deal politically viable. But second of all, I would note that in the status quo, because of the overturned window, the Green New Deal is already the minority, which is why AOC and Bernie Sanders continue to be sidelined in the status quo. It's unclear to me how they can have politically fungible action and imagine a world where suddenly everybody unites under climate change, especially if you buy my partner's extension about why this often gets crowded out by more pressing, urgent, electorally determinant issues like COVID-19, guys. Third of all, as CO concedes, there's limited political will. So in the best case, they change 1 or 2 policies, insufficient for the structural change that they agree is urgent in the status quo. But fourth of all, we will point out this is uniquely bad because it politicizes environmentally friendly policies, and we shouldn't have to risk that because this risks democratic backsliding and reversing these policies in the long run. I give you an example of, for example, Obamacare. Everybody will agree universal basic healthcare coverage is a universal basic good, but it's unclear to me why politicizing it through their instruments makes it a good thing because now Republicans have the leeway and the plausible deniability to shoot it down but claim the political high ground. With that, I think CO's whole case is out the window and they are condemned to a fault. Now, I want to note about OO's analysis, why they are reductive if not financially illiterate, because they make a bold claim that the private sector is already investing damn heavily in green technology. Guys, okay, so I don't want to like flex or like say this out loud, right? But like, I fucking work for a venture capitalist and I tried to pitch them an ESG stock. My paper got torn in half and thrown out of the building for virtue of the fact that as per OO's analysis, these are speculative, massive growth potential. Let me unpack these euphemisms and what these mean in financial terms. This is risky. This is uncertain. Your costs and your benefits are going to be materialized in 10 years at the very minimum. Which angel investor has the bandwidth to invest a massive part of your portfolio in this? She says like, but portfolios are fungible, so we can invest like 5%. Okay, so our argument is that you should invest more than 5% of your portfolio in green tech companies, and that's a universal good as per OO's analysis. But I would posit that my partner's extension uniquely breaks this deadlock for 2 additional reasons. First, he points out that angel investors are uniquely anti-ESG because of the high startup costs associated with, for example, solar power plantations, and how they have limited funds. Any venture capitalist only has about 1 $1 billion. How much of that portfolio are you going to invest into environment? But second of all, we point out that for many angel investors, they have a very short-term mentality. They want to outperform the market. Look at, for example, all the motors of the angel investors in the status quo. They say, we want to outperform every quarter, which is why they are inherently short-term and would rather opt for other opportunities such as e-commerce, big pharma, glove tech, and technology, and not invest in ESG companies. It's unclear why ESG companies have this fungible financial literacy under their side. But last of all, as per their portfolio analysis in their vanity projects, I would suggest they're going to, at best in their scenario, invest really, really small sums of money as a token appreciation for said vanity project, rather than sizable amounts of money that we require for the structural change. At the end of the day, this is important, panel, because we cannot buy OO's analysis that climate change is a wash. It is not. We need to save the planet today, because if we don't reduce temperature by 2% in the next 10 years, we are going to fucking die and perish. Humankind will get extinct, and the Anthropocene will become permanently irreversible. Now, I want to point out at this point that CO's case is kind of like a knife of the opening, because he said, but restructuring is costly, restructuring is long-term, and the change in business models are uncertain. This is the reason why OO also condemned themselves to a loss, as a consequence of CO's analysis that suggests the structural change is really damn high. But second of all, I will point out that when CO draw the faulty assertion that they're going to cut corners and abuse workers, this is already happening in the status quo. I want them to name me one coal mine that doesn't exploit their workers to 0-hour contracts, to inhumane conditions, and the lack of safety standards. So I would suggest for the developing world, transitioning away from these exploitative industries that currently accumulate profits only for the patron clients, only for the oligarchs on the top, is an objectively good thing. And central banks should try to pivot away with the concomitant less political opportunity cost by using them as the objective instrument. Yeah, okay, before that, I want to take OO for engagement.
Yeah, so angel investors is clearly a straw man. We told you firms also want to do R&D for when fossil fuel production cost goes up. You have to diversify. Eventually, we accept this. We just say they can't weather the shock.
Fair. Okay, the reason why this is damn hard in the status quo is because even if I acknowledge JP Morgan has an ESG wing and they're like, guys, fossil fuel is dying out. The problem is that their biggest client right now is still ExxonMobil, guys. So it's unclear to me why JP Morgan will have a board meeting like, you know what, let's backstab ExxonMobil in the back because they are suddenly going to die out. In fact, I will point out collusive incentives on the part of institutional investors like JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs to continue having a massive clout in terms of the environmentally unfriendly sector, which is why you don't get any change under your side. But this leads on nicely to the two pieces of extension my partner gives you and why we take it over OG as well. We are the only side that prove exclusivity analysis to the extent the central bank should be the main vector of change. And this also takes us, mind you, above OG because they only prove why the central bank is a good actor. They don't prove why the central bank is the only actor for this change. And here's where I want to further clash with Jason's POI. Because I'll point out there is no alternative for change when private sector behavior collusively outcompetes friendly carbon neutral companies. JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs are their biggest clients in the climate polluters. So it's unclear to me why ESG investments get any less predatory insofar as now they have a perverse incentive to continue levying damn high interest rates when an angel investor or when a solar panel plant comes to you and wants a loan. That is why they don't get any form of structural change under their side. But second of all, my partner talks to you about the developing world, to which we hear no response coming from CO. We prove to you why the unique benefit of being non-derivative in this sense means that we should not prop up inefficient industries that beget problems of exploitation in the status quo, where economic profits continue to be only accumulated by the top 0.1% and they continue to perpetuate horrible working conditions. Second of all, I would know that alternatives to resources exist. It's just a very patronizing thing to say. The developing world can only develop if we use resources, because Singapore was a developing world 50 years ago. We had no natural resources and we still developed. So non-resource related pathways towards development are eminently possible. For all these reasons, incredibly proud to stand on CG.
Thank you very much for that speech. I would now like to welcome the opposition whip. Here.
Hi, am I visible and audible?
Yes.
Give me a second to sort out my papers. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I want to do two things in this debate. First, tell you where the economy is more screwed. Second, tell you where the climate is more screwed, weighing towards all houses will be integrated. First question with regards to why the economy is more screwed. I want to note that inflation isn't this random harm that may affect some people. Andrew tells you two things that tells you stuff like inflation and stability particularly affects the most vulnerable. One, it often has a direct impact on these individuals' incomes and ability to purchase goods. Secondly, it specifically affects primarily poor individuals' ability to afford basic necessities and have control over their lives. The opening gov response to this is twofold. The first, that this has happened before. Two responses. One, obviously not to this extent, insofar as central banks alternate between different economic aims, not completely different priorities in terms of change from an economic priority to a climate priority. Therefore, I think the change is far larger. But secondly, this is a cop-out, right? Because insofar as you want a large restructuring of the economy, you must concede there is a large change such that investors want to shift where they invest, such that companies opt into your deal. But the second reason they give you is that expert investors are present in central banks, therefore expectations won't change. One, expectations have to change if you want a massive restructuring, i.e. all your benefits of investors like shifting where they invest and backing different companies rely on investors changing where they invest and thus inflation happening at the same time, because there is required to be a lot of economic activity in order for this to happen. So just if expectations don't change, there is no benefit. But why do we think beyond all houses, the economic outcome here is the most crucial in this debate? We think this is the weighing that opening up don't give you. One, Andrew tells you that humans deserve the illusion of control, i.e. with more money, individuals feel like they can protect themselves even if they can't. Insofar as starvation could happen, such as a flood could happen at any day, humans having money and the most poor and most vulnerable among us having the feeling like they have control over their lives give them a unique form of empowerment that that cannot be understated. Insofar as opening, like all teams concede climate change is likely to happen, so starvation for some people and all is likely to happen, we give you the most mutually exclusive benefit in that individuals have this illusion of control. Irrespective of what the harms are, they are likely to live a higher quality of life, they are likely to feel far better about the lives they lead. But secondly, we think climate change is marginally more equitable in that it semi-equally screws over everybody for two reasons. One, the rich have incentive to fund like flood walls as well, insofar as climate change is unpredictable in exactly what way it will manifest itself on certain areas, and therefore they have similar incentives to protect countries and large swaths of people from this. And it's a lot harder to discriminately have climate change protection than it is to fuck over poor people. Because the second thing, which is the extension Andrew gives you, is that companies react aggressively, often by downsizing production and screwing over the most poor and vulnerable workers with the least cost to their bottom line as possible. So even in the best case scenario of opening gov, where they do make these large scale changes, they still do have to cut costs, they still do have to restructure. So note that necessity of restructuring literally means that they have to cut down the most manual labor, the most vulnerable individuals that suffer the most. So even if more people get affected on gov, I think on a balance of vulnerability, we protect the individuals that need the most protection. And note, we do this best because we're the only team that gives you a specific reason why the most vulnerable will be first harmed by companies that downsize aggressively, even in developing countries, right? Because it's not just developing countries as a whole, it's why companies in developed and developing countries will fuck over their workers. And insofar as this applies to both contexts, I also think we take it over opening up. So the conclusion to this is we think the economic outcome is the most crucial in this debate, and we need to prioritize it over all else. Even if we lose everything else, we should win this. Before anything else, I'll take opening gov. Quickly, please.
Big polluters are the main entity that requires change. We explain why central bank policy exclusively targets their business model. Why do politicians do this better? How do they persuade ExxonMobil as per extension that you just dropped?
Okay, yeah, excellent. That's literally my second issue, right? What about climate change? So note, opening government's reasons about more capital being funneled into companies by investors, stakeholders' pressure, are all snowball effects that are contingent on opening government proving that shifting this business model is more profitable than copying the extra cost of losing out on higher on lower interest rates, right? And they don't do this. Andrew tells you why it is more profitable to not change your business model. One, restructuring takes a lot of time. Two, you have to hire new workers with different amounts of expertise. Three, it inherently requires a lot of uncertainty. And note here, companies, so even if all the characterization of all the houses are true about how green tech is profitable, companies want to earn as much profit as they can from the fossil fuel era before transitioning. So even if we concede that like green tech has a lot of potential and there's like a lot of incentives in the future to invest, companies still want to stretch out this certainty of profit as far as they possibly can, right? And fourthly, they're more willing to risk fines, i.e. all the fines that are there to deter companies from like screwing over workers and having shitty safety protocol now become less deterring because they have these other costs. The only response we hear in closing down is this already happens in status quo. So one, it happens more because there's more cost, but two is like stakeholders want a stable, constant income, which just means that companies are now more willing to take risks that they weren't willing to take before, i.e. they are willing to take the risk of copying this fine by screwing over workers, by having like shitty safety regulations, because they're okay with risking the fine. It's not as bad, but it's far easier to risk this fine, i.e. we can cover up a lot easier. Companies have way to make things secretive as opposed to having to cop this definite cost by restructuring. And we think companies are more likely to want to bet on themselves in controlling their revenue, i.e. sticking with their current business model, as opposed to changing due to external market forces and changing their business model, which just means they have far less control. This means two things. One, they screw over workers a lot more. I already told you why those harms are the most important in this debate. But two, this must be contrasted to the climate impact to consumers through the gov. This response to opening government's POI about like how our policy leads to the same harm, right? We tell you this is specifically worse because it leads to one, right-wingers having more ammunition to say, look, this supposedly independent body is now administrating our personal choices for us, which means that one, people become less climate conscious because they feel like everything is already taken care of, as opposed to individual political actions that give less complacency than people saying the entire administration has changed. But two, you lose votes in the ballot box for any regulation, for any long-term change. And insofar as all houses concede the best thing to do is change consumer patterns, they make consumer patterns far worse when consumers have less incentive to be climate conscious, and you turn people further away from climate consciousness. And note that this legal ability stuff and voting in good laws is prior to the benefits of opening opposition, and so it's logically prior to the benefits of opening opposition about investment, and therefore we take that debate as well. The stuff of politicization, you politicize it, you attach politics to central bank, people become less climate conscious, people hate you more. For all these reasons, closing off. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech and for the entire debate. It was a lot more fun than I expected a debate about central banks to be. For all the teams, please go outside, shake hands, I guess, well, digitally. I guess we will come back to you soon with a call in the Discord.
Thanks for the debate, troops.
Thanks, guys. Best of luck.
Thanks, everyone.
Orcom, can I just confirm that this
Sí, esta es la tierra que te acogió cuando lo necesitaste, la que se puso a tus pies para que la descubrieras. Es la tierra que saboreaste con los tuyos y de la que guardas infinitos momentos. Sí, en ella descubriste la inmensidad del mar y la fortaleza de la montaña. Conociste el poder de la piedra y la fuerza del viento. Sí, también hubo un día en el que tocaste fondo, pero la pureza del agua hizo que te levantases. Sí, aquí fue donde te dejaste atrapar por la historia, arropado por la grandeza del pasado y los más puros sonidos ancestrales. Y sí, ahora que hiciste todo eso, sigamos descubriendo más. En Lugo, sí,